To start off, everyone loves conferences, right? So we do have conferences. We have our own conferences. These are some slides from our first big NSCF forum meeting that we had since I joined. So there was one prior to this. But here we went to a place called Godini Spa down in the Western Cape. It's a really beautiful venue in the mountains just outside Worcester. I think we had almost, it was about 130 or 140 people there. And we had a really great time at this conference. Please note, first thing I want to point out here is there are no PowerPoint presentations. You don't see anybody giving PowerPoint presentations here. I'll come back to that a little bit later. We had our second forum earlier on this year, and this time we had to do it on Zoom because everything is now happening on Zoom. And so we didn't have the people together, but here you can see everyone kind of doing their thing on Zoom. And we try to make these meetings as interactive for everybody as we possibly can. And one of the things that was quite fun with our forum earlier on this year, so we bring all kinds of different activities into these meetings. And we had this, excuse me, we had a photographic competition. And so people, we had different categories and people could submit photographs for the most beautiful specimen and the most interesting specimen or the rarest specimen and things like that. So these were just some of the photos. One of the specimens that people submitted a photo of is this great white shark that is in a tank at Siab down in Grahamstown. And this is also quite a cool one. So this is actually a display that's on one of our that's up in one of our museums. I mean, someone went to a tremendous amount of trouble to put this together. So this is actually a little stuffed mouse. And it's in one of the bigger sort of displays in the museum. That down in the bottom corner of the display is this little window, and the kids look through and they see this little mouse. And here he's got Africa Geographic and Country Life, and he's got a book on self-defense against cats and various other things like that. And the kids really love this. So this is one of the photographs that was submitted. So what is the NSCF? What is this thing all about? So we have this vision statement, which is that we want the NSCF to be a dynamic network that values and recognizes the African context to promote, upgrade, and make accessible natural science collections and data for research and services to enable sustainable, enriched life on Earth. So it's basically a network of natural science institutions, it's museums and it's herbaria. So some of you might have visited the Ditsong Museum here in Pretoria. That's our big one, our big public museum that we have here in Pretoria. Another notable one is Iziko down in Cape Town. Some of you might have visited that. It's also a very large institution with extensive public displays. They've got a really amazing whale room there with all these huge models of whales and whale skeletons suspended from the roof. And when people typically visit these institutions, they see this public-facing side of it. They see these displays, these kind of stuffed animals in cabinets and things like that. But there's a whole other side to these institutions, which the general public don't typically get to see, which are these very large collections of preserved specimens that are in these big collection rooms, which are used for research. So the NSCF has 16 partner institutions. I've got the logos here on the screen. Like I say, some of these are museums, some of them are herbaria. So herbarium is a collection of dried and pressed plant specimens, and they've got these big cupboards with stacks of these specimens on the shelves. And these collections are really important for a range of different types of research, but probably, I mean, this is just, my feeling is that one of the most important is taxonomic research. And so taxonomy is the science of discovering and describing the diversity of life that occurs on the planet, that we share the planet with. It basically forms the foundation of other fields of research in the biological sciences, because basically any kind of research that you're doing with living organisms, you need to be able to put a name to those organisms, and so that people know what you're talking about. So for the majority of the taxonomic work that gets done around the world, the work is based on these specimens that sit in these collections. So you've got taxonomists that collect specimens, put them in the collections, and then they look at the specimens and work out, is this one different enough from that one to actually describe it as a new species. So, but there are a range of other kinds of research that get done with these collections as well. People are starting to use them for various types of ecological research. You can extract samples for isotope analysis from these specimens. People look at things like change over time with climate change. So are the organisms getting bigger or smaller, or changing in other ways in terms of their morphology? And I think something else that's becoming increasingly important is the kinds of research that people are doing with the data associated with these specimens. So you can see here underneath these pinned insects down here at the bottom, each specimen has got a label. So every single specimen in all of these collections, and we're talking millions of specimens just in South Africa, and billions of specimens around the world. But each one has got this little label underneath it, which has got the information about what the animal is, where it was collected, who collected it, and perhaps there's some ecological data, like what kind of habitat. Perhaps there's behavioral data, like what it was doing when it was collected. And so this is a vast resource. This data that's on these specimen labels is a vast resource for research as well. And that's the side of things that I'm involved in, which is basically the digitization of those data off the specimen labels and into these big collection databases, and getting that data published online and freely accessible for the scientific community to use. And scientists are finding all kinds of really interesting and creative ways of taking these new, very large data sets and asking questions of those data sets. So they'll take a data set of pollinators, pollinator occurrence and abundance, for example, and compare that to data sets of flowering times in plants and see if things are changing there. So traditionally, data sets that would have been very separate are now being integrated to answer all kinds of big science questions. So it's really interesting. So this project, the Natural Science Collections Facility, is funded by the Department of Science and Innovation. And it's led by Michelle Hamer, who I will introduce in a second. And she has been passionately involved with collections in South Africa for her entire career. And one of the things which has been an issue in the collections community in the country is the long-term care and preservation of these collections. So some of our institutions in the country are quite well funded. They've got all the resources that they need to manage these collections well, but some are not. Some are really struggling. They're understaffed, they're undercapacitated, and they're not able to procure the kinds of materials and resources they need to look after these collections. And so there's quite a significant concern about the the long-term future of those collections. And so I think it was in 2010, Michelle and a few other scientists did this assessment. They went around and they visited various collections in the country, and they assessed the collections for how well they were being cared for. And they found that in many cases there were quite significant concerns and challenges with the care of those collections. And so following on from that, she was kind of working on that and looking for opportunities for how this could be addressed. And then the Department of Science and Innovation created what's called the National Research Infrastructure Roadmap Project. So basically what they did was they said, we want South Africa to be globally competitive in terms of the research that we do here. And we are going to therefore invest in research infrastructure, the key term being this research infrastructure. And so they started a whole range of different projects, basically building infrastructure for different kinds of research. I don't know what all the projects are, but I know that there are some omics projects. So this is like genomics and proteomics, these big like molecular type projects where they're building big fancy facilities and sequencing machines and things like that. There's a project which is looking at climate change, or we'll call it global change and change in ecosystem functioning related to climate change. And so they're putting up these flux towers. So, flux towers, this kind of structure that measures all kinds of gases and things like that in the atmosphere just above the ground, temperature sort of from the ground up to, however high the flux tower is. And so they're putting these flux towers in all over the country to try and just get a better sense of what's going on in terms of ecosystem functioning around the country. And then there's another nice example is that there's a long-term human, they call them longitudinal health studies, where they basically identify particular people in communities and then they track their how they're doing health-wise and socioeconomically and all of that kind of thing, basically for the rest of their lives. And that generates a whole lot of valuable data that can be used for a whole lot of different purposes. So when this project, this research infrastructure project was started by Science and Innovation, Michelle and some of the other people involved at quite high levels within these collections institutions said, let's pitch this idea of these collections representing research infrastructure for the country. So personally, I think this was brilliant. Traditionally we had all of these different institutions all over the country operating independently and essentially in isolation from one another. They had their own collections and they did things their way. Some of them were struggling, some of them were doing well. And Michelle said, let's look at all of this stuff as research infrastructure, as a research asset for the country as a whole. This group of people pitched this idea to Science and Innovation, and they went with it. They bought into the idea, and I think that was a fundamentally important step for our collections institutions in the country, because it means we have a high-level government department viewing all of these institutions together as a unit as research infrastructure for the country. So the NSCF is basically a project that's all about transforming these institutions from this current kind of landscape where they have operated independently into a single unified research infrastructure. And it really has quite significant challenges with the other projects like installing flux towers. All they have to do is go and build flux towers. They don't have to deal with what we have here, which is we kind of have all of these institutions already with all of their staff, with their own individual institutional culture, and trying to draw all of that together into one single operational unit, which is quite a challenge. So the way that we like to think about this, and this came out of this process that I'll tell you about in a moment, is we try to think about the collections institutions in the country as an African village. So this is an aerial photo of a village. I think it's somewhere further north in Africa, in Ethiopia or Sudan or something like that. But you see these nice little family units. So these sort of little groups of huts and little storage units and all the rest of it, which are individual family units, but all together they form this village. And this is the kind of the analogy that we have in our mind working with the NSCF and trying to build this community, is that each individual institution is kind of like a little family unit with all the things